Imagine spitting on a powerful crime boss in front of 200 witnesses and then paying the ultimate price just weeks later. Today, we dive into a story of betrayal, fear, and brutal consequences that shook an entire city. Every detail you're about to hear comes from true events and verified sources. This isn't fiction. Before we dive in, tell me in the comments where you're watching from! And if you appreciate content backed by thorough research and true data, hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss the deep dives we bring every week. It all began on a seemingly ordinary evening in a bustling part of the city, where people were going about their lives, unaware that a moment of pure audacity was about to unfold. The streets were crowded, a mix of locals and tourists, vendors calling out from their stalls, and the hum of daily life filling the air. It was the kind of scene where nothing extraordinary usually happens until the confrontation occurred. Amid the crowd, the man in question spotted Bumpy Johnson, a name whispered with both fear and respect in certain circles. Johnson wasn't just anyone. He was a legendary figure in organized crime, known for his intelligence, strategic thinking, and ruthless enforcement. Seeing him in a public space, the man made a decision that would seal his fate. Without hesitation, he approached Bumpy Johnson and, in full view of everyone around, spat directly at him. The act was shocking, not just because of the disrespect it carried, but because it was done so openly, in front of dozens of witnesses who could hardly believe what they were seeing. People froze, unsure if they should intervene or flee. The audacity of the act rippled through the crowd. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, and the energy of the busy street shifted into tense silence. Those familiar with the criminal world understood immediately that this wasn't just an insult, it was a provocation, a challenge that could not go unanswered. Bumpy Johnson himself didn't react immediately, at least not in the way people might expect. He maintained a calm exterior, which only made the tension thicker. In the underworld, composure is power, and anyone who shows weakness becomes a target. The crowd, meanwhile, began whispering, taking note of faces, trying to gauge whether the situation might escalate into violence right there on the street. For the witnesses, this was more than just a public spat. It was a glimpse into a world most people never see. Some of them would later describe feeling the weight of fear in the air, the kind of fear that makes your stomach drop and your instincts scream at you to leave. In that crowded street, the rules of ordinary society felt suspended. This was a moment governed by respect, reputation, and the silent but deadly power of fear. Little did anyone know. This single act in a crowded public setting would set off a chain of events leading to one of the most gruesome outcomes imaginable. A public humiliation in front of hundreds would become a deadly prelude, a warning that, in Bumpy Johnson's world, no act of disrespect goes unanswered, and no witness could ever forget the tension of that day. The moment the man spat on Bumpy Johnson wasn't just an act of impulse, it was a deliberate display of defiance. He wanted everyone to see it, a brazen challenge to authority. In the world Johnson controlled, disrespect wasn't taken lightly. It wasn't just a personal insult, it was a public declaration that the rules of the streets didn't apply to him. As the crowd looked on, the victim's actions became even more audacious. He didn't hide, he didn't apologize, and he didn't flinch. His body language screamed confidence, or perhaps recklessness. In that instant, he transformed from a bystander in the bustling street to the center of everyone's attention. People whispered among themselves, some horrified, some in disbelief, wondering what could motivate someone to openly provoke a figure as feared as Bumpy Johnson. Those familiar with Johnson's reputation understood immediately the gravity of what had just happened. To disrespect him publicly was a dangerous gamble. Johnson had built his empire not just on strategy but on fear, and fear demanded respect. This man had broken an unspoken rule in Bumpy Johnson's world. Disrespect in front of witnesses was a threat that could not be ignored. The victim didn't stop at the spit. He added words, mocking, jeering, showing a complete disregard for the potential consequences. Every insult, every gesture, echoed through the crowd like a challenge issued to the king of the underworld. Observers could feel the tension tightening, a silent warning that what had begun as a single act might quickly escalate into violence. What made this disrespect even more shocking was its audacity in timing and location. This wasn't a private confrontation, and it wasn't hidden from the public eye. It was in the heart of a crowded street, in front of hundreds of people who could later testify, or worse, become unwilling witnesses to what came next. It was a calculated risk, but one that no one could have survived unscathed. The crowd's reaction reflected the danger. People moved subtly away, some frozen in disbelief, others glancing nervously at exits, instinctively sensing that the air had changed. What was once an ordinary urban scene had transformed into a stage for a deadly lesson in power and respect. The victim's audacity had painted a target on his back in plain sight of everyone present. By the end of the encounter, it was clear to anyone watching that this was more than mere insolence. It was a fatal mistake. In the world of organized crime, disrespect is a currency far more dangerous than money, and the victim had just spent his recklessness in full view of a kingpin known for enforcing his reputation with brutal efficiency. Single act of open disrespect would echo through the weeks that followed, leading to consequences no one could ignore. The crowd that day was massive. More than 200 people packed into the streets, each person going about their own business, some shopping, some chatting, others just passing through. No one expected to become a part of history that afternoon, yet all of them would unknowingly witness an act that would lead to unimaginable consequences. The sheer size of the crowd meant that the confrontation wasn't hidden. It was impossible to miss. From every corner, eyes turned toward the scene as the victim approached Bumpy Johnson. Whispers spread quickly through the throng, people nudging each other. Curiosity mingled with fear. Some tried to edge closer, hoping to catch a better view, while others instinctively recoiled, sensing that something dangerous was about to unfold. The energy of the crowd shifted from casual chatter to tense anticipation in an instant. As the disrespect unfolded, the spit, the mocking words, the defiant gestures, the witnesses became frozen spectators to a drama they didn't ask to see. Faces in the crowd registered shock, disbelief, and for a few, the realization that they were witnessing a crime in the making. Many instinctively recorded the moment on their phones, unaware that this seemingly small act would later become evidence in an investigation. The presence of so many people amplified the audacity of the act. In a smaller, private setting, the victim might have expected to get away with it, or at least limit the humiliation to a few eyes. But by daring to act in front of hundreds, he made his challenge impossible to ignore. The more witnesses there were, the heavier the weight of the insult, and the more dangerous his decision became. For the witnesses, fear mixed with fascination. No one wanted to be caught in the wrong place if violence erupted. Yet they couldn't look away. Some later admitted they felt the tension, like a physical force pressing down, the kind of dread that settles in your chest when you know someone powerful has been publicly provoked. Every heartbeat seemed louder, every movement slower, as if time itself had stretched to accommodate the unfolding drama. Law enforcement and bystanders alike would later describe the scene as chaotic, yet eerily still. Everyone alert, everyone aware of the unspoken rules of the street that were suddenly in play. The victim's audacity had turned a public space into a pressure cooker of fear and expectation. The crowd wasn't just watching, they were witnesses to the consequences of crossing one of the most feared men in the city. By the end of the encounter, it was clear that being observed by over 200 people had not just exposed the victim's defiance, but had cemented his fate in the public eye. Each witness carried the memory of what had happened, a chilling reminder that disrespect in front of so many was not just dangerous, it was a public declaration that could not be ignored. In that sea of eyes, the rules of the streets had been rewritten in an instant, and the outcome was inevitable. The moment the victim spat on Bumpy Johnson, it wasn't just a public insult, it was a spark thrown into a powder keg. Within the tight, knit circles of the mob, word of such disrespect spread almost instantly. Loyalty, reputation, and fear were the lifeblood of this world, and any challenge to authority could ignite chaos in a heartbeat. The air within Johnson's organization shifted immediately, thick with tension and anticipation. Inside the mob's inner circle, those closest to Johnson exchanged uneasy glances. Some muttered under their breath, anger simmering at the audacity of the act. They knew that ignoring it would not only weaken Johnson's authority, but also invite others to act similarly. In the underworld, perceived weakness is more dangerous than any weapon, and this public insult demanded a response, swift, precise, and unmistakable. As the word spread, the tension wasn't limited to Johnson's inner circle. Associates, rivals, and even lower, level enforcers felt the pressure mounting. Conversations that had once been casual became laced with fear, speculation, and strategic plotting. Everyone understood that a single misstep could lead to disaster, and the insult had thrown the entire ecosystem into instability. The mob's reputation depended on control. Each member knew that the public spat was not just personal. It was a statement challenging the hierarchy. If Johnson failed to react decisively, it would signal that disrespect could go unpunished. This realization sent a wave of unease through the organization as they weighed their next moves and prepared for the inevitable retaliation. Tension escalated further because the act was witnessed by over 200 people. The incident wasn't private, it had been broadcast to the world. A humiliation recorded in the minds of everyone present. In the underworld, honor and fear are currency, and the victim had just spent a fortune of both in a reckless moment. Johnson's team knew the stakes. A measured but brutal response was now essential. Even within rival circles, the act caused murmurs of concern and intrigue. Other crime figures watched closely, trying to predict how Johnson would respond. Any miscalculation could trigger a chain reaction of violence beyond the original insult. The city's criminal underworld collectively held its breath, knowing that tension had reached a boiling point and that a violent resolution was likely inevitable. By the end of that day, it was clear to everyone in the mob the insult could not go unanswered. Planning, discussion, and silent threats dominated conversations. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation, a dangerous calm before a storm. The simple act of defiance had thrown the organization into high alert, setting in motion a chain of events that would culminate in a violent and gruesome conclusion. Bumpy Johnson's reputation wasn't built on fear alone, it was reinforced by action. Those who crossed him quickly learned that his organization dealt with disrespect and betrayal without hesitation. Swift retaliation wasn't just a warning, it was a rule of survival in his world. Every member of his crew understood that loyalty was measured by obedience, and any perceived slight demanded an immediate, decisive response. Stories of Johnson's previous punishments circulated through the city like dark legends. People whispered about rivals who disappeared after crossing him, businesses that were destroyed for siding with the wrong person, and those who dared speak out of turn who never lived to regret it. The victim, by spitting in Johnson's face, had just stepped into a system where consequences were both inevitable and merciless. Within the organization, planning for retaliation began almost instantly. Johnson's lieutenants understood the need for precision. Swift action had to be calculated, sending a clear message without creating unnecessary exposure. Every movement, every decision was measured to maintain dominance. In this world, hesitation was dangerous, and delay could be interpreted as weakness. The efficiency of Johnson's crew was legendary. No one doubted that they could locate the victim quickly, even in a city teeming with people. Networks of informants, loyal associates, and covert surveillance ensured that nothing went unnoticed. The message was clear in Bumpy Johnson's organization. Disrespect doesn't just fade away, it is hunted down. Word of the insult traveled through the ranks at lightning speed. By the end of the day, the mob's inner circle had already outlined potential strategies for exacting vengeance. The goal was not only to punish the victim, but to demonstrate the consequences to everyone else who might even consider defiance. Swift retaliation was both a method of control and a public display of power. This culture of immediate retribution created a chilling environment in which fear and respect were intertwined. Associates knew that any hesitation could endanger them as well. Each member of the organization was acutely aware that Johnson's response would be thorough. Failure to act decisively would undermine the entire hierarchy. The air was thick with anticipation, a silent but deadly countdown to retribution. By the time the victim realized the gravity of his actions, it was already too late. Johnson's organization was moving, meticulously planning, and ready to strike. The speed and precision of their retaliation were not impulsive, they were methodical, calculated, and inevitable. In the world Bumpy Johnson ruled, disrespect wasn't just punished, it was obliterated, leaving no room for error, no second chances, no mercy. Weeks passed after the confrontation, but the city never forgot the audacious act that had unfolded in its streets. The victim, once bold and defiant, seemed to vanish from public view. Rumors swirled among the criminal underworld, whispers of fear and speculation, as people wondered whether he had gone into hiding or if Johnson's organization had already begun its work behind the scenes. Then, the shocking news broke. The victim's body had been discovered. The sheer brutality of the crime sent waves of horror through the community. For those who had witnessed the initial disrespect, the revelation confirmed what everyone had feared, that in Bumpy Johnson's world, defiance carried consequences that were both swift and deadly. The act of disrespect had not been tolerated. It had been answered in the most extreme way imaginable. Authorities were stunned by the scene. The victim's remains were not just a body. They were scattered, grotesque, and horrifyingly detailed. It was immediately clear that this was no random act of violence or gang feud gone wrong. This was a calculated statement, an unmistakable message to anyone who might think to challenge Johnson's authority. Every piece of the crime screamed vengeance and power. The discovery also revealed the meticulous planning behind the act. Whoever carried out the murder had ensured it left a lasting impression, one that would resonate long after the initial act of disrespect. In the criminal underworld, symbolism is as important as action, and this gruesome display served as a vivid reminder that challenges to authority were met with merciless precision. The public reaction was a mixture of shock, fear, and morbid fascination. Newspapers and local media covered the story with a mixture of disbelief and sensationalism, but beneath the headlines was a simple truth. Fear had been reinforced. Those who had once dared to challenge or mock powerful figures now reconsidered the risks, understanding in a visceral way that defiance could have consequences beyond imagination. For the witnesses of the original incident, the discovery of the body brought a chilling sense of confirmation. The tension they had felt weeks earlier had been justified. What had seemed like a daring, reckless moment of defiance had transformed into a deadly lesson. Their fear, once unspoken, solidified into a grim understanding of the reality of organized crime. By the end of that week, it was clear across the city that the incident would not be forgotten. The victors quickly realized that this was not a crime of passion or chaos. It was calculated, methodical, and intentional. The dismemberment was executed with precision, each cut deliberate, almost ritualistic in nature. It was a statement, a message, meant not only for the victim, but for anyone who might consider crossing Bumpy Johnson in the future. The scale of the dismemberment shocked the community. In a city already familiar with the dangers of organized crime, this level of violence felt unprecedented. News of the gruesome discovery spread rapidly, and even those on the fringes of Johnson's influence understood the clear lesson: disrespect comes at the highest price. The body's condition ensured that fear would linger far longer than the memory of the initial insult. For those who had witnessed the public confrontation weeks earlier, the reality of what had happened was almost too much to process. What had seemed like a moment of audacity had culminated in an unimaginable horror. The sheer number of pieces made it clear that this was a carefully orchestrated act, intended to erase the victim entirely while leaving an indelible mark of terror on everyone who knew the story. Law enforcement and forensic teams approached the case with extreme caution, documenting the scene, cataloging each piece, and piecing together the events became a painstaking process. The crime scene itself became a study in meticulous planning. The way the body had been divided showed the hand of someone experienced and intentional, someone who understood the psychology of fear as well as the mechanics of murder. The dismemberment also served as a psychological weapon within the criminal underworld. Stories of the 50 piece body traveled faster than any official report, spreading through whispers, warnings, and rumors. Associates, rivals, and even ordinary citizens now carried the story in their minds, a constant reminder that crossing Johnson meant more than death. It meant obliteration, a literal fragmentation of self that would shock anyone who dared to challenge him. By the end, the scene of 50 pieces had become more than a crime. It was a symbol of power, revenge, and the extreme measures that Bumpy Johnson's organization was willing to take. It sent a message across the city and the underworld. In this world, disrespect is not forgiven, and the consequences are both absolute and unforgettable. From the moment the gruesome discovery was made, investigators faced a daunting task. The victim's dismembered body provided clues, but connecting it back to the audacious public confrontation weeks earlier was far from straightforward. On the surface, it appeared as another violent act in a city already familiar with crime. Without witnesses willing to talk or clear evidence, the case could easily have remained unsolved. Forensic teams meticulously examined every piece of the victim's remains. Fingerprints, DNA, and ballistic traces were analyzed, but the passage of time had complicated matters. By the time the body was discovered, crucial evidence from the initial street confrontation had been lost, the crowd dispersed, and memories fading. Authorities had to piece together a narrative from fragments, like assembling a puzzle with most of the pieces missing. Witness cooperation was another challenge. The initial public confrontation had been seen by over 200 people, but fear silenced many. Those who had watched the audacity unfold had little desire to come forward. Speaking out could make them targets. In a world ruled by fear and power, loyalty often extended beyond life itself, and revealing what they had seen could have deadly consequences. Investigators also had to navigate the complexities of organized crime. Bumpy Johnson's reputation alone made it difficult to find credible leads. Many in the underworld remained tight-lipped. Even casual acquaintances of the victim were wary of associating with the case. Linking the public act of disrespect to the eventual murder required connecting dots that were often hidden in plain sight, obscured by layers of intimidation and secrecy. Despite these obstacles, law enforcement persisted. They analyzed footage, spoke to vendors and passersby, and attempted to reconstruct the events of that fateful day. Each piece of information, no matter how small, became a critical clue. Slowly, patterns began to emerge, an unmistakable connection between the public act of defiance and the grisly outcome weeks later. The delay between the insult and the murder further complicated the investigation. The weeks in between allowed for cover-ups, false leads, and strategic misinformation. In the eyes of the authorities, it became a test of patience, deduction, and resilience. Every detail, from the location of the body to the timing of the events, had to be scrutinized to establish a link that could withstand legal and forensic examination. Ultimately, the challenge wasn't just about solving a murder, it was about untangling a story of power, fear, and calculated violence. The public act of disrespect had triggered a chain reaction, but proving that chain required navigating a web of intimidation, secrecy, terror. It was a stark reminder that in the shadowy world of organized crime, truth is often hidden beneath layers of fear, and justice requires extraordinary persistence. Even after the crime, the crowd that had witnessed the confrontation remained silent. Over 200 people had seen the victim openly disrespect Bumpy Johnson, yet almost no one came forward. Fear had gripped the witnesses tightly, a paralyzing awareness that speaking out could make them the next target. In that world, silence was survival, and caution outweighed conscience. Every passerby remembered the intensity of the moment, the defiance, the audacity, and the sheer power that Bumpy Johnson commanded. The air had been thick with tension, almost electric, and for many, the thought of confronting that power weeks later was unthinkable. Witnesses, worried that law enforcement protection might not be enough to shield them from retaliation, and that even a whisper could reach the wrong ears. Those who considered talking to authorities hesitated. Their minds raced through worst-case scenarios, threats, harassment, or being singled out as an informant in the eyes of the mob. In the criminal underworld, loyalty and fear extend beyond the immediate moment. Even indirect involvement could be deadly. For some, staying quiet was not just a choice, it was a lifeline. Rumors among witnesses further fueled their silence. Stories circulated that others who had defied or angered Johnson were taken care of in ways so extreme that they became cautionary tales. Each whisper, each second hand story reinforced the reality that retaliation wasn't just possible, it was inevitable. The threat wasn't always immediate, but the shadow of it lingered constantly. The authorities struggled to gain cooperation, recognizing that fear had created an invisible barrier around the truth. Detectives tried to reassure witnesses, offering anonymity and protection, but in a world where reputation and fear dominate, even the promise of safety often felt insufficient. The psychological grip of terror proved as effective as any physical threat in keeping witnesses silent. This fear extended beyond the direct witnesses. Friends, family, and even business associates of those present were caught in a web of unease. Everyone in the vicinity understood, consciously or subconsciously, that being linked to the incident, even peripherally, could draw unwanted attention. The ripple effect of fear stretched far beyond the initial confrontation, shaping the behavior of hundreds of people. Ultimately, the silence of the witnesses underscored the power and reach of Bumpy Johnson's organization. Fear had become a tool as lethal as any weapon, controlling not just action but thought. The unwillingness to come forward served as a reminder that in this world, intimidation is absolute, and survival often depends on staying unseen, unheard, and unmentioned, even when the truth burns to be told. News of the victim's gruesome fate spread like wildfire through the criminal underworld. It wasn't just a murder, it was a spectacle, a carefully orchestrated demonstration of power. Every detail, from the public insult to the discovery of the dismembered body, carried a clear message: disrespect Bumpy Johnson, and there will be consequences beyond imagination. Within mob circles, the story became a cautionary tale almost overnight. Associates, rivals, low-level criminals alike understood that Johnson's reach extended far beyond what they could see. The victim's defiance had been public. The punishment had been calculated and total. It was a vivid reminder that power in this world isn't just about influence. It's about fear and the ability to enforce it with ruthless precision. The message was reinforced by the method of the murder. 50 distinct pieces, each carefully arranged, left no doubt that the act had been deliberate. It wasn't chaos or revenge born of emotion. It was strategy, an unmistakable warning to anyone who might think they could challenge Johnson's authority. The criminal community recognized immediately that such a display demanded respect, or else. Word traveled through whispers in backrooms, late night conversations, and street corners. Stories of the incident were retold in vivid detail, each retelling amplifying the terror. Those who might have considered challenging or disrespecting Johnson now hesitated, the memory of the 50-piece body serving as a mental barrier. Fear, rather than loyalty, became the dominant force controlling behavior. Even rival organizations took note. Competitors who might have seen opportunities in Johnson's empire now understood the risks of crossing him. The murder had a ripple effect, not just consolidating his power, but discouraging challenges from outside forces. The criminal world, for a moment, was united in recognition of the consequences of defiance. The psychological impact was profound. Within Johnson's own organization, members felt both reassurance and dread. On one hand, they saw the efficacy of their leader's authority. On the other, they understood the stakes of failure or misjudgment. The chilling nature of the message ensured that obedience wasn't optional, and fear became a silent enforcer of control. By the time the story had fully circulated, the city itself had changed. Underworld conversations, alliances, and rivalries were now influenced by the lesson learned from the victim's fate. The murder wasn't just a punishment, it was a symbol, a clear and terrifying communication that in Bumpy Johnson's world, power is absolute, and disrespect is met with merciless finality. Once news of the murder broke, the media couldn't ignore it. Headlines screamed of the shocking and grisly discovery, emphasizing the brutality that had stunned the city. Reporters and editors knew that this was more than a crime. It was a story that would captivate, horrify, and haunt readers, a real life tale that blurred the line between fear and fascination. News outlets described the details with careful sensationalism. Every gruesome fact, the public insult, the weeks of disappearance, the discovery of 50 dismembered pieces, was presented to emphasize the extremity of the act. The city's residents, already aware of organized crime, confronted a reality far darker than most had imagined. The media painted a vivid picture, leaving no question that this was a punishment intended to terrify. Television and radio coverage brought the story to life for the public. Anchors described the investigation, the witness fears, and the ongoing police efforts with gravitas, stressing the calculated nature of the crime. Each report highlighted not just the act itself, but the ripple effect it had across the underworld, amplifying the perception of Bumpy Johnson's power and the deadly consequences of defiance. Journalists dug into the background of both the victim and Bumpy Johnson, adding context that made the story even more chilling. They highlighted Johnson's history of swift retaliation and ruthless enforcement, connecting past acts of violence to the current atrocity. The coverage didn't merely report the crime, it framed it as a lesson in the terrifying efficiency of organized crime. Editorials and opinion pieces debated the implications. Some focused on law enforcement's challenges in confronting organized crime, while others examined the psychology behind such acts of extreme violence. The public was invited to understand not just what happened, why it had happened, and how power and fear could shape a world most people would never see firsthand. For the criminal world, media coverage became a double-edged sword. On one hand, it exposed Johnson's reach to a wider audience, solidifying his fearsome reputation. On the other, the intense scrutiny reminded everyone in his circle that even in acts of ruthless efficiency, attention could bring both influence and danger. The story's circulation ensured that the lesson of the victim's fate would echo far beyond the immediate participants. By the end of the week, the murder had become more than a news story. It had become a symbol. The media had immortalized the extreme brutality, ensuring that the act of defiance, the punishment, and the chilling consequences were etched into the collective consciousness. Across newspapers, broadcasts, and word of mouth, the story reinforced the terrifying truth in Bumpy Johnson's world: disrespect is a risk few can survive. Even years later, the story of the victim's audacious disrespect and gruesome end remains a chilling lesson in the dynamics of power within the criminal underworld. It is referenced not only by law enforcement and historians, but whispered among those still navigating the streets, a constant reminder of what happens when respect is ignored. The case has become a blueprint for understanding the brutal efficiency of organized crime. Scholars, journalists, and criminologists often cite it as a clear example of how leaders, like Bumpy Johnson, maintain control through fear, visibility, and unflinching consequences for defiance. It's a real-world illustration that authority in the underworld isn't granted, it's enforced, and sometimes in terrifying ways. For those in criminal circles, the story serves as a warning passed from one generation to the next. It's more than rumor or legend. It's a documented example of the costs of insolence. Disrespecting a powerful figure in public, no matter how bold or reckless, is understood as a gamble that rarely pays off. The victim's fate is cited in conversations, both as a deterrent and a lesson in obedience. The cautionary aspect extends beyond violence itself. It highlights the intricate web of reputation, fear, and social dynamics that sustain organized crime. Single public act of defiance doesn't just provoke retaliation, it can disrupt power structures, influence behavior across communities, and force individuals to reassess every interaction. The story remains a vivid case study in control and consequence. Law enforcement also views the case as instructive. It underscores the challenges of investigating crimes where intimidation silences witnesses and fear shapes narratives. Understanding the psychological impact of fear, the mechanisms of intimidation, and the patterns of retaliation can provide insight into organized crime and the extreme measures used to maintain authority. Even in popular culture, the story endures as a symbol of power and consequence. Books, documentaries, and analyses often recount the details, not merely for shock value, but as a lesson in the realities of crime and human behavior. The public fascination with the narrative ensures that the cautionary tale continues to resonate far beyond the original incident. Ultimately, the case serves as a stark, unforgettable warnings in worlds governed by power and fear. Disrespect is never inconsequential. It is a reminder that actions, no matter how bold, carry weight, and that authority, when enforced with ruthless efficiency, leaves little room for error. The victim's fate remains a chilling testament to the brutal realities of organized crime, a lesson etched into memory for anyone who dares to challenge it.